So, first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. You may recognize the quote. It was from Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the opening lines of his first inauguration speech, which was held on March the 4th of 1933. It was, by the way, the last inauguration speech held in March. For you American history buffs, presidential inaugurations were held on March 4th from 1793 until 1933. It was FDR's second inauguration, which was held on January 20th, and all others since then. But I digress. It is about fear that I want to say something today. Because whether we realize it or not, fear is part of life. Our Torah portion opens with fear. After 20 years of running away, Jacob returns to Canaan. Until now, he had believed that he could deal with almost any challenge by talking his way out of it. But at this moment, he had to face the truth about himself. At this moment, he could not run away anymore. And now, as he approaches his father's house, Jacob experiences fear. Esau is approaching him. Sorry, one second. Esau is approaching him with 400 men. There's no way to talk himself out of this situation. His brother has every reason to hate him and good reason to kill him. The Torah dramatically says, Vayira Yaakov me'od, vayatzer lo. Jacob was greatly afraid, and he was anxious. What did Jacob fear? The rabbis offer at least 3 different interpretations, which I want to share with you today, partly because of what it says about Jacob, partly because in this fearful time in which we live, these 3 ideas ask us to consider what it is that we fear. Interpretation number 1 is that Jacob feared that he was not worthy of God's protection. You remember when Jacob left home and had the vision of the ladder and the angels at a place where he renames Beit El, and again today, God had promised to look after him. But now, in this interpretation, Jacob looked at his brother with a certain amount of admiration. You see, Esau never left the promised land, yet Jacob spent much of his adult life in Aram, enriching himself and raising a family. Could it be that Esau was more worthy of God's blessing than Jacob? Not only that, but Esau remained a more dutiful son to his parents. Okay, he was a bit of a pain in the tush, but he was the child that was there and available to help as his parents aged in place. While Jacob never even wrote home, he didn't call, he didn't send money, he left it all to his brother to take care of his parents. In this interpretation, there are 2 kinds of fear. First, the fear that is often triggered by a lack of confidence in ourselves. In times of crisis, we often question ourselves. Are we smart enough? Are we fortunate enough to make sure that we can come through the crisis unscathed and uninjured? That's the blessing that we recite after a personal crisis, the Gomel blessing. And then there is an underlying, if unspoken, fear. It is the fear of Isaac and Rebekah and all parents as they age who wonder who will be around to help them. It's like the mother who says, that she's able to raise 2 and 3 and 4 children by herself, but it takes all of them to take care of her. And it is the fear in all children who wonder what the responsibilities they will have to their aging parents and how it will affect their lives. Interpretation number 2 comes from Rashi. Jacob's fear, he says, has to do with the nature of his meeting with Esau for good reason. Rashi comments on the double expression that Jacob both feared and experienced anxiety. What's the difference? Notice the insight of Rashi. He writes that Jacob feared being killed by Esau. But now listen to the second half. Rashi says he was anxious lest he be forced to kill his brother. In other words, Jacob feared for his body and his soul. Our forefather neither wanted to be a victim nor the aggressor. Reading Rashi, I think of our people in Israel who experience fear and anxiety, fear of physical violence and threats from their borders and from Iran, and anxiety of becoming killers themselves. It was Golda Meir who famously said, "Peace will only come when the Arabs will love their children more than they hate us." The threat to Israel is not just physical, it's existential and spiritual, and most Israelis understand this. And for us facing our current crisis, we find ourselves anxious, not only about our physical well-being, but our emotional and spiritual well-being too. The current pandemic has left us feeling fear, anxiety, and vulnerable. The last interpretation, number 3, that I offer today is from the Netziv, Rabbi Naftali Tzvi Berlin, who lived in the 1800s in Warsaw and was the head of the great yeshiva of Volozhin. He was, in a way, the precursor to FDR, since to him, the real curse that Jacob had was the fear itself. The Netziv explains that Jacob was afraid of confronting his brother and that his awareness of his fear is what caused him anxiety. The way I understand this is that the Netziv understood that fear is a natural part of life. We have to experience it, whether we like it or not. And yet, we're not always willing to acknowledge fear as normal. The Netziv tries to tell us fear is natural, and that accepting our fear, rather than pushing it away, is the only way to confront life's challenges and crises. This is how the Netziv explains it when he writes, how does Jacob respond to his fear? He gives expression to it so that he can move on. In his prayer before the meeting, his brother, he says, "God of my father, I am unworthy of your kindness. Deliver me, I pray, from the hands of my brother, lest I fear he come and strike me down." Having acknowledged his fear, it is then that Jacob can move on to meet his brother, first in a nighttime vision, and then face to face, ending, as we know, with an embrace. May I say that these are fearful times for us, but as with all things, we have a choice. We can allow fear to paralyze us, or we can acknowledge and respond to it with strength. We can either live in fear, or we can learn to live with fear. The idea that I leave you with this Shabbat, for you to consider and for you to agree or disagree based on these interpretations, is to consider that our greatest fears are both before us and within us. We have within us the key to wrestle like Jacob with our fears and our anxieties, and like Jacob, who walked away from that encounter with a limp, to overcome them with an embrace. Shabbat Shalom.